This year, the report will focus again on social and mobile news, the desktop internet, ad blockers, getting more popular, and consumer attitudes toward native advertising and sponsored content. And presenting it will be David Levy, director of the Reuters Institute, and Nick Newman, the editor of the Reuters Institute. So, gentlemen.
As we said, this is the fourth year that we at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford that we published this report. So it means we're starting to get historical trend data. We've also expanded the number of countries, so we've got a fuller and more representative view of what we're covering. In terms of background, the data is based on the largest ongoing survey of news consumption in the world, over 20,000 people in 12 countries. This is an online poll, so it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behavior such as TV, print and radio when we look at cross-platform behavior. We're grateful to a wide range of sponsors that have made this possible. First, our core sponsor of the Reuters Institute, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and then the many other sponsors of this report who are listed here on the page. They include the BBC, Google, France Televisions, and the University of Navarra here in Spain, along with many other universities, regulators, and news organizations. The report contains some country pages that give you a sense of there we are. Country pages for all 12 of the countries we cover. Here's an example of the Spanish country page. For each one, we have a short profile of the media landscape, and then we have some figures about news consumption offline and online, and which are the top brands in each country. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Nick Newman, who's the lead author of the report, to talk through the main findings from this year.
So firstly, obviously, the impact of mobile and the smartphone in particular. And here is the increase that we've seen over the last 12 months. A really sharp uptake, so it's a really quickening, particularly in countries like the US and the UK, also in Japan, you can see there, which has been lagging a little bit behind. Overall now, 40% of our entire sample in every country is using the smartphone for news every week. And in contrast, we see fewer people using the computer to access news and a dramatic slowing in the growth of tablets for news. So tablets now settling down to around half the level of smartphones in most countries. But of course, the smartphone growth is much faster. That's a very different picture, maybe, to the one that we thought about a few years ago. Just as an example, so when using public transport, these are UK figures, to access news, now 68% are turning to their smartphone in the UK in an average week, and that's up 20 percentage points on 2013, significantly outstripping printed newspapers that used to have the monopoly of that. And then, interestingly, smartphones, unfortunately, are also able to distract us from the news. So in this statistic, 51% of people who watch the evening television news on TV admit to being distracted by email, browsing the web, or using social media via a second screen. So it's very much a double-edged sword. We suggest that the move to mobile and the move to smartphone could be deeply problematic for news companies over the next few years. So 70% of people in our survey have downloaded at least one news app onto their mobile phone. But on average, only a third are using a news app each week. Secondly, we see that people tend to use fewer sources on a mobile than they do on a tablet or computer. So on average, and we should remember that because it's different for the people in this room, but in general, 1.52 sources per week only. And then on smartphones and tablets, one of the fastest growing ways of getting attention, reminding them about your brand, is notifications and alerts. So over the past 12 months, and we're going to be talking more about this over the next few years, we've seen a substantial increase in pretty much all countries, particularly, as you see there, in France and the US. News organizations ramping up their efforts in a bid to get people coming back more often. We heard this morning about how news alerts and notifications were crucial to the success of Periscope, for example. Sources of news. So looking more widely, we can put online in the context of more traditional forms of news with the benefit of 4 years of data now. What we see in, this is the US and the UK, broadly online is actually flat in terms of weekly reach. Television news beginning to dip in some countries. particularly for bulletins and programs, and particularly for young people. But the main change which we see in all countries is the decline of print, so that's the orange line, and within the online sector, the growth in importance of social media. But this is not just about access, it's also about importance. And when we ask about the main source of news, we see, yes, differences between countries, but particularly between generations. So here you see 60% of 18 to 24, so that's the blue bar on the left-hand side, say online, including social media, is their main source of news. But the blue bar on the right-hand side, for television, only 27%. And for over 55, it's completely the reverse. So this makes it really hard for many traditional organizations to satisfy this increasingly divergent behavior. This, I think, is a really nice slide which adds a bit more nuance to that story. And what we see is that television news is still considered the most reliable and the most accurate. Print a bit better for analysis, and social media very strong for speed and finding new stories, that discoverability. So moving on to social media and messaging apps. So here we have, I think, unique data across countries that look at which social networks are important generally, but also specifically for news. And the top level picture is essentially the growing strength of Facebook. 41% use Facebook for news on average across our 12 countries. That's up from 35% last year. And also, two of the fastest growing networks, Instagram and WhatsApp, are also Facebook owned. WhatsApp, we talked about it last year. Over the past 12 months, we've seen really substantial growth in a number of countries, and particularly for news, especially popular in Brazil during the recent presidential elections, but it's also been used by many media companies, including the BBC, for news gathering in places like Nepal. But usage, as you can see here, is really very uneven. So very high usage in a lot of those countries, including Spain at the top, but just 1% in the United States, for example. So different messaging apps are popular in different countries. And you can see there the popularity of Snapchat, we heard about it this morning, Instagram and Tumblr, generally, obviously, but also increasingly for news. And many of these are providing platforms and monetization opportunities for news companies and for brands. And then it's worth remembering that even the core networks are very different. So Twitter is very much a destination for news. So people go there actively looking for news, whereas Facebook's primary purpose is around communication. So you might bump into it while you're there. And that's why we also see that the type of news that works is different in those networks. So again, this is data from Newswhip. It counts the shares. So the top publishers in Twitter, consistently serious news brands like the BBC and the New York Times. Facebook tends to be more focusing on the fun side, so Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, brands like that. So another headline from this year's report relates to the growth of new visual online news and obviously especially video. So we see a really significant jump, 5 percentage points across all of our countries on average, when we've averaged it. In total, 21% now accessing news videos online weekly. And that's partly obviously because there's much stronger advertising revenue around video, but it's also because of the increased supply from news organizations like Trinity Mirror, for example, in the UK. But also because of the much better distribution possibilities within social platforms like Facebook and Twitter, of course, I think yesterday announced autoplay as well. So we're going to see that really driving a lot of news use. And then in terms of the types of video consumed, so it's mainly around that on-demand, around the short clips, providing the drama, the context, but also increasingly live experiences around breaking news. The arrival of Periscope, Meerkat, and all the rest may or may not accelerate that trend. We'll, I guess, find out next year. But before we get too excited about video, we should be aware that the majority are still not consuming online video. And of these, 40% say they essentially just find reading more convenient, so effectively the flexibility and control that comes with text is better for them. Other reasons include pre-roll ads, so 29%, so they're citing that as a reason not to use news video. Screen sizes, load times, also an issue for some. Moving on to disruption for traditional brands and the impact of all these changes in formats and distribution on the traditional sector. So this first chart pulls together the reach of traditional media online. So that's the blue bars. That's broadcasters and newspapers effectively put together in a single bar, and then digital-born brands and aggregators, that's the red there. And what we see for various reasons, traditional brands are much more affected in some countries than others. So on the left, countries like Finland, Denmark, the UK, brands tend to be stronger. They've also moved quite aggressively sometimes into online, leaving less of a gap. Whereas in Australia, Japan, the US, you can see that the level of disruption is much higher. And on a global scale, when we average and weight all the numbers, just for the 12 countries we look at, the BBC, CNN are now behind the Huffington Post online in terms of online weekly reach. So just finally, some data on the business side and on attitudes towards paying for news, either directly or indirectly through advertising. So firstly, paid content, where we find that the headline numbers paying for online news in any form, so that's a subscription or a one-off purchase, is still relatively low in all of the countries we look at. So just 6% in the UK have paid over the last year, rising to 14% in Finland, where newspapers have been remarkably successful in getting people to pay. So these numbers haven't really moved very much for the last couple of years. So what has changed over the last few years is the proportion of those who are paying on an ongoing subscription, which is obviously very good for revenue. So now 70% of those paying in the UK, for example, are paying on subscription. So as a result, we see that paid news revenues in the UK are more than twice as high as they are in Spain, even though the headline rate is lower because there's much more one-off purchase. But in terms of the prospects of getting more people to pay, well, they look pretty bleak. So of the people who say that they haven't paid already, 75% say they wouldn't pay a cent for online news. And the average amounts that people would be prepared to pay across all the people who are currently not paying would be sort of £4.50 in the UK, €4.50 here in Spain. And another real concern which comes out of our data is the number of people who now say that they have installed ad blocking software on their computers or mobile devices. We only asked this in the UK and the US. But both in our survey and also in focus groups who ran on this issue, we found real resistance to the often intrusive nature of online advertising, particularly on the mobile. And those groups who use news most heavily, and also the young, are the ones who are most likely to have installed these ad blockers. Just finally, moving on to sponsored and branded content. So a lot of that is then leading people to some of these new models of advertising. And we haven't got time to go into it in detail, but in the report you'll find an essay where we did focus groups and particular research on attitudes to sponsored and branded content. And one of the headlines was that we found that 33%, so a third, felt disappointed or deceived after reading an article that later turned out to be paid for by an advertiser. Secondly, in terms of whether people found that sponsored content was actually useful or valuable on topics that were of interest to them, 13% said that was valuable to them. In the UK, it was actually slightly higher at 22% in the US, where there's more sponsored content. And then in terms of what this does for the reputation of news brands as opposed to advertisers, 28%, so over a quarter, felt more negatively towards the news organisation. Though we did find a real difference between the types of content. So if you're talking about more entertainment or softer or feature content, which is already more commercial, people were much more comfortable about this type of advertising, where for serious news, for politics, or for business, people were very concerned. So smartphones changing the experience, changing the formats, lots of opportunities, but what about that problem of attention? How do we deal with that problem of attention as a news industry? How do we deal with the challenges of the move to off-site consumption? So how do we deal with social networks, mobile platforms, aggregators? It's the whole question of video. Is it just another? Is this a real opportunity, or is this another false dawn? And then finally, a whole bunch of questions, I think, emerging out of the business models with the move to mobile. So thank you very much. And the slides.
Nick, just to pick up on your point about native content and sponsored content, the report did find, right, that there's a difference in terms of age, that younger news consumers are actually more tolerant of this native advertising than older ones, right?
Exactly why that is, but I think one of the reasons is probably because they see a lot more of it on sites like BuzzFeed, and a lot of those are around, say, maybe there was one we showed people, for example, around tequila, and it was different things you could do with tequila. So this is not content that is, in that heavy news domain.
The report found at one point that readers have a higher trust for news media that try to be impartial, which warms my AP heart, certainly. But that also seems to fly in the face of the very popular concept that that reporters are at their best these days when they reveal their feelings, as long as they're transparent about it. Are the supporters of impartiality to draw a lot of strength from this report?
I mean, I think there's two things that we find about impartiality. One is attitudes to this vary country by country, and I think that may be affected by sort of media environments as to how polarized those media environments are. The other thing is there is a general support for people. I think there's two things going on. I think people like comment, but if we ask the slide that was shown there about which source is best for accuracy, which of the many platforms is best for accuracy, the answer is that television comes out top. And that is generally, it's not the case everywhere, but generally I think that's a reflection of the fact that in many countries television tends to be less partisan. It's not the case in your country, but tends to be less partisan than print in the range of countries that we've covered. So I think there's two things going on. I think people do like views, but I think they also want, there is still a demand for news that has some kind of authority behind it and news you can trust. And I think the truth is we're all in different modes at different times. Sometimes we want comment and views. Sometimes we want to know somebody's view of the truth, even if we may all be very skeptical about ever knowing what the truth really is.
Do you see a trend towards reuse of content from other languages, so typically from English, localized in national languages, or do you think that the media spheres are still very national?
On the basis of the research, we haven't asked questions about translation. We have asked questions about providers from outside your own country, which is not quite the same point as yours, and there we are seeing some growth in provision of news internationally, but that's usually, I mean, the Huffington Post is the most interesting example, where you have an organization that is providing, in partnership often with local news organizations, providing some kind of additional news experience, which at least in its infancy came from outside the country. But we haven't asked a question about translated news, no.
What you're feeling here, you said that smartphone users are going to fewer sources, fewer apps, but at the same time, I think you also found that via social networks, people see more and more sources. So what's the bottom line?
There's the whole question of brand recognition. So maybe when they were answering the first one, they're saying, well, how many regular brands do I go to, or which ones can I remember? And it's not very many. But obviously, those heavy users of social media tell us that a lot of them, I think it was 3/4, say that actually social media encourages them to find news from brands they wouldn't normally use. So it's actually increasing the range of brands that they see on a weekly basis. Again, to put it all in perspective, you have to remember there's a lot of people who don't use social media. So a lot of people we saw who are using social media as a source of news, but the majority aren't using social media as a source of news. And so they're probably the ones who are using fewer, particularly on a smartphone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.